Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the third in our webinar series of Adapting in 2020. My name is Georgie Statius and I'm the Chief Engagement Officer at Fetching Events and Communications, and it's fantastic to have you joining us here today. Whether you're joining us for the first time or whether you're returning from one of our previous webinars, it's great to have you here. So as people are starting to join the meeting, I might get you to just pop in the chat box and making sure that you've got it set to all panelists and attendees, and just let us know where you're joining us from and also the type of events that you run. So I'll just give you a few moments to start typing in the chat box and then we'll get started. Fantastic. We've got Jessica from Melbourne, Outdoor Events and Festivals. Yep. West Vic Dairy, fantastic. Welcome, Liza or Lisa. It's great to have you here. Fantastic. So we've got people coming in from Global Citizen, from Panola SA. So it's fantastic to have a whole range of events that people are running, from workshops, field days, donor engagement to member events. It's fantastic to have you here and I'm really keen to share insight. So we've got quite a bit to cover during the next hour and we will try and keep it to an hour. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I first of all would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands of which we're all meeting today, because we are all coming together from different lands across Australia, and we've got some people coming in from overseas as well. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this webinar will run for an hour and we will cover quite a bit during it, but I'm really excited to share some insights and get some discussion happening. So this is being recorded and please feel free to write in the chat box as we go along. And certainly if you've got any questions, I'll try and answer them as we go. Otherwise, we will have some time for question and answer at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn off my camera and we'll dive straight into the webinar so you can concentrate on the slides, and then I'll be back at the end. So what we're going to cover today, I guess the first thing I want to say is that none of us have a crystal ball, and we certainly don't know what the future will hold because we've never been through something like this before, but we can certainly look to the past to get some clues. And my passion is very much around engagement. It's about how we run events that engage, whether it's to grow our memberships, whether it's to connect people in the community, whether it's to fundraise, professional development. It's not just the nuts and bolts of running the event, but it's actually understanding our audience and our customers' needs and their behaviour. So what I'm keen to do is look at some past epidemics and cocooning to not only see how it changed behaviours and impacted on the way we live now actually, but also the legacies that it's created. Because we are going to need to adapt our events for a range of reasons, whether it's because of government restrictions, whether it's because of travel bans, whether it's because of economic impact, but most of all because we will have some changed behaviours that will come out of this epidemic. And when the pandemic hit and restrictions were first talked about and started to be imposed, my mind went immediately to the polio community. And I had the good fortune of working with Polio Network Victoria and polio survivors for about 6 years, running their Polio Day event, which was an annual information day each year. And what I remember most about that time is that when we would look for venues, we would always need to find a venue with natural light, a big, wide open space with natural light, because 50, 60, 70 years after the epidemic, they still associated it with being cocooned, locked up and isolated. So it was so interesting for me to see how far-reaching that impact of something that happened in the 40s and 50s still impacted on a community today, and still, I guess, impacted on how we ran that event. And what I'm keen to look at is that people will have different lived experiences through this time, and things that we just need to think about when we're planning our events. So before we get started, a little bit about Fetching Events and Communications. We're a boutique agency specialising in communications, project management, event management and volunteer management. And our passion really is around engagement. So as I said, it's not just about an event running on time or the food coming out or selling all the tickets. It's actually, have we met the purpose? So if the purpose is membership sales, have people gone away and signed up as a member? If the purpose is to grow fundraising and create long-term donors, have we actually done that? Or have we just run a fantastic gala ball that everyone raved about, but in fact it hasn't connected them truly with the charity organisation and it hasn't converted to long-term donors? So that's where our passion lies. So as I said, for us, the success of an event isn't just the nuts and bolts. They're very important, don't get me wrong, but it's actually that engagement piece, because that's truly how we will connect with people. And if there's one thing we know about events, is that it connects people, and that's what we're really interested in. So a little bit about me. I've got nearly 25 years experience in the event industry, and I thought it was no use putting a glamour photo up there because we all know the reality of events, which it's not glamorous. And I've worked on anything from large international events, from the Australian Open to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting and the Asian Games, right down to very grassroots events such as pioneering Working Horse Festival with blacksmiths and Clydesdales, to being a judge at a teddy bear's picnic, to taking Winnie the Pooh and Tigger around Australia to 6 shopping centres. And between that, I've done everything and anything from gala dinners, conferences, community events, graduations, fundraising launches. So there's probably not much that I haven't seen in my nearly 25 years in the event industry. So before we get started, I'm just keen to do a little poll, and I'll just launch it now, to understand how your events have been impacted by the current situation. So we'll just take a couple of seconds for you to vote on that. Great, so I'll just give you 5 more seconds and then we'll look at the results. So if we look at the results, the majority of events have been cancelled, which is understandable. We've got events that have been postponed with a date to be determined once the easing of restrictions is known, and that's certainly a common one, because it's, you know, what we do want to avoid is postponing an event and then finding we've rescheduled it too early and then having to postpone it again. Events being postponed but a date already determined, and for many of those I would think they probably will be next year. Events moved online, fantastic, and events being adapted to hybrid. So I think it's great to see how the event industry is adapting. We have been heavily impacted, but there are ways that we are moving through it. And I'm actually really excited for the future of events and what it will look like. Okay, so if we move on to the next, the first section is learn from yesterday, live for today, hope for tomorrow. The important thing is to not stop questioning. And that quote resonates with me so much, because this is a time where we can look to the past to learn. There's certainly hope for tomorrow, but it's about questioning and really looking at how we've been running our events, and is that way going to be relevant in the future? Because it's not a straight postponement. A lot will have changed, and there'll be changes, as I said, imposed on us around restrictions, but also change in people's behaviours. So it's not just postponing an event from maybe March this year to March next year and just running exactly the same program and the same format. There's a lot we'll need to think about from our audience's point of view of how we can best engage them based on how they're feeling. So let's have a look at some past epidemics and cocooning. So the first one is the Spanish flu, and this one's talked about quite a bit in comparison to COVID. And there's certainly a bit of talk around the Roaring Twenties that came out of World War I and the Spanish flu and the social changes that happened. And I was really keen to see, does that actually match the research and the data that was coming out? So a little bit about the Spanish flu. 3 deadly waves, mainly between 1918 and 1919, claimed 50 million lives. It crossed over with World War I, which is one of the reasons that it spread, because people were moving around during the war. It had a behaviour that the virus would come and hit, ravage a community, and then move on. It was at a time where infectious diseases were still the main killer of people. And just like today, it imposed restrictions on people. So businesses were closed, there were stay-at-home orders. There was no air travel due to the time, but news did travel slowly due to illiteracy at the time. But one thing that I found really interesting in looking in the Spanish flu was that the pandemic was remembered individually as millions of discrete tragedies, not necessarily something that happened collectively to humanity, which is actually how we're looking at COVID now, and that will have an impact on how people behave. So after the Spanish flu, it led into the Roaring Twenties. And despite what, some commentators are saying, I don't think there can be a natural parallel, because during the Spanish flu, like polio we'll talk about, people were already living through a war. So people were already living and had changed their behaviour. They were already living through really austere times. So particularly in America, where they had predicted there would be a recession, people had had the war, people had then had the Spanish flu, and then they were predicting a recession. So they'd already been through a lot. And there was a little bit of a blasé view of, well, if the war didn't get me and the disease didn't get me, I'm going out to party. And people had scrimped and saved during the war. So they actually had money to spend. And it was down to what was the, they were going to spend that money regardless of what the risk might have been. The world was already going through some social changes. And I think this is actually something that we can look at with COVID, because we were starting to see trends, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And I actually think COVID in this current time will speed up those trends. So the world at that time was already, we had the women's right to vote, assembly lines and mass production were starting. So for the first time, people were starting to share a culture because of mass production. And if we think of cinemas starting to be introduced, they were starting to share that culture. And that's actually happening now if we look at it when we think like Netflix, that you can share watching a show with a friend on Netflix, or people sharing cocktail hour on Zoom or social media. During COVID, it's actually forcing us to share parts of our culture that we may not have done previously. And there was an economic upturn after, because they had gone through the war, the pandemic, they'd missed the recession. They perhaps didn't know it was going to come a little bit later. But there were changes that came out of that, and that's really interesting to understand. So then I want to quickly look at polio. So polio was around approximately from the 1930s to the 1960s, but obviously we know polio is around in parts of the world still today. It crossed over with World War II, so once again, it's a pandemic or an epidemic that's come straight after a war. People were used to austerity, so their behaviours were different. And I, in fact, chatted to a friend, one of my polio survivors, recently on one of my Insights interview series about what it was like when they came out of polio. And she said, what you've got to understand is we'd already been in restrictions because of the war. So the impact on Australia, polio killed 2,000 people and paralysed 40,000, mainly children. It was sort of known as the children's disease. Just like us, it closed schools, beaches, shops, cinemas. Economies shrunk in towns and states during outbreaks, which of course we're seeing here. There was a fear of transmission, which we understand that. And people were told no personal contact. So shaking hands was eliminated, those same things that we're experiencing now. So then what happened after the polio outbreak? Well, the big end probably was the vaccination. But if we just look at that photo on the left-hand side, Fran is in the orange shirt. And when I chatted to her, she said that one eminent polio doctor that she often talks to says to them, what was the end of the polio polio epidemic, and they say the vaccination and this and that. And he said, no, it was actually hand washing. So hand washing really came into play during polio, and obviously has stuck with us after. Polio personality, so they talk about how resilient people are that came through the polio epidemic. They're very type A personalities because they had to learn to just battle on. So what were some of the things that came out of polio? Physical therapy certainly was a big thing that came out of how they treated polio survivors, and it was quite a first for the time. Modern disability rights really ramped up after polio. But what are some of the legacy traits? And as I've said earlier, when I spoke to Fran, she still has a sense of claustrophobia from her time of having polio. She still has a fear of being constrained. She still has a real need for natural light in buildings. And she often talks about, we went through such a hard time, I always think we deserve a really nice venue. So as I said, an epidemic that was in the 30s to 60s, it's still impacting on their life now. So how is our current situation going to impact on our audience and our guests' behaviours as we go forward? So the next one I want to look at is SARS, which is a more recent one. And this was around 2002, 2003. It affected 26 countries. There were 8,000 cases. And 774 people died. But what were some of the things that came out of SARS? So quarantining, once again, was a big thing, but social distancing really came into play with SARS. It's still really remembered in the countries that it impacted and has quite a long-lasting legacy. And just like COVID, businesses were closed, nightclubs were closed, restaurants abandoned, shopping centres, malls were desolate during this time, and medical professionals died. So there is some more parallels with what we're going through. But for something like SARS, which is a more recent one, what happened after SARS? So in the research I've been looking at, there was a real talk about a mixture of hope and fatigue. So people were fatigued from going through it, but there was hope that they were now coming out of it. Some of the research I looked at talked about that there wasn't a clear sort of end to SARS, but what people started to realise was that the benefits of going out, or people, I shouldn't say realise, but started to make the decision for themselves, that the benefit of going out was greater than the risk to them at that time. But what were some of the long-lasting legacies that came out of SARS? Limited surface touching. So suddenly the sight of someone touching a lift button or a traffic light button with a tissue wasn't something out of the normal. Someone holding a pen with a tissue wasn't something out of the normal. And in fact, some of these practices have continued since SARS. Civic responsibility, and I think we've certainly heard a lot about that at the start of COVID, when there was discussion around how Hong Kong had managed to maintain it, was because they understood civic responsibility. So people understood what their responsibility was in containing it, and they changed their behaviours around that. Some good news, there was a quick bounce back with tourism and consumerism, and then face masks absolutely became the normal. So as I said, I'm really keen to look at how behaviours changed from other health crises to really open up our mind to understand that there will be changes that will happen out of COVID, because remember, we don't have a vaccine, we don't know when one will come in. So our life will be changed until that happens. So how do we make our events, and how do we adapt and adjust our events around that? So I just wanted to highlight, because I think this is really interesting, some other health crisis and legacies. Cholera, out of cholera became sewer systems. So the London sewer system was a direct result of cholera. Piped water systems in America came out of a yellow fever outbreak. Tuberculosis, there used to be something called the common cup, which would be on a public transport or in public places. And through the tuberculosis outbreak, that was eliminated, and we saw the rise of the drinking fountain and the disposable cup. Bathrooms changed because of hygiene. So if we think to really early bathrooms with wooden encased vanity basins and bathtubs and toilets, that wood started to give way for much more open and exposed bathroom surfaces that could be easily cleaned. The bottom black and white photo was because there was an end to the wallpaper in bathrooms, because people saw the dampness as being unhygienic, and people started to have clean white walls, because clean white walls reflected sunlight, and light was considered as a disinfectant. And I'm sure we've all heard some chatter similar along those lines at the moment. So that just gives you an idea of how much health crisis can change the way we live and change behaviours. So let's have a look at the current mood, because once again, in order for us to engage effectively, we need to understand our audience. Now, I should preface this by saying that this data does change, and this will be familiar for anyone who's joined in the other webinars. But at the moment, people are feeling isolated, uncertain, but hopeful, stressed, but optimistic, anxious, but motivated, frustrated. And it's probably not unlike those moods that were coming out of SARS, of fatigue, but hope. So what are people looking for? The key thing people are looking for is connection, and there's certainly a lot of talk about a social recession because we've lost that connection. And if there's one thing we know about events, it connects people. So events will be so important when we come out, but it's how we come out and how we run those events. So the data is showing that people are looking at the moment for safe, helpful, supportive environments. What they want is self-improvement. They're looking at a lot more meaning focused, and they're looking to learn. What are they looking towards? Things will be very localised when we come out, and this partly will be forced upon us because of the way restrictions are rolled out. Neighbourhoods will be more important than ever. Communities will be more important, and not just geographical communities, but actually communities people have been parts of, whether it's members of a charity or members of a professional association or members of a music festival. So localised neighbourhoods will be more important than ever, because that's where we've spent all our time, and communities will be more important. And we will come out of this leaner. And I don't mean that in an economic sense, but I mean that in a sense of people will be more focused. They'll be more considered. They're looking for more purpose. And for the first time, well, not for the first time, but actual contribution is being valued more now than it ever has been. So if we look at things like cleaners and people stacking shelves at supermarkets, we're now understanding how important they are. So purpose is really coming into play. And so that leads us to think about the purpose within our own events and how we tie everything back into that. So we've looked at how people have changed behaviours. We've looked at how people are feeling now. And now I just want to launch another poll to, I'll just do this now, is to get an understanding of perhaps how you're feeling on the webinar today about when restrictions are eased, what sort of things you'll do. And I'll just give you some time to vote on that. Okay, I'll just give you 5 more seconds and then we'll launch those results. Okay, so if we look at that, there's 2 really key things I want to point out. The first is that we're not going to rush out, according to everyone here, when restrictions are eased. And that's really important to think about with our events, because there is a tendency to be planning our new events for when restrictions are eased without actually thinking about the behaviour of the people that will be coming to our events. It also shows that everyone is feeling different in how they're going to re-emerge out of this. So that's something we just need to keep in mind. Okay, so I just want to launch another one. And this is, if restrictions ended in the next month, which of the below would you feel very or fairly comfortable in doing? Whether it's going and meeting friends outside your house, or whether it's shopping in a supermarket, or shopping in shops. Just have a vote, and which sort of things you would feel comfortable doing. And I'll just give you a few more moments to vote on those. Okay, so if we look at those, which reflects, remember we talked about that we would start quite local when we came out of this, and this is reflected in just the small bit of research we just did here. So meeting family and friends outside your house. So we'll start off localised. We'll start within maybe our geographical area, but in our immediate circle of community. Supermarkets, we're probably already doing that now. Some of you may be in your workplace. And then if we go down, it's things like public bars and restaurants, public transport and large events, which is where we're going to start feeling less comfortable. And once again, we need to start thinking about that as we go. So I just want to look at a little bit of research that's been done. Bearing in mind, this is in the UK and America, and they're certainly going through a different time to perhaps us in Australia, but it just gives us an idea of how people are feeling. So a Reuters poll that was conducted in the US in late April showed that 42% of Americans who follow sports, arts, events avidly said they would return to them before a vaccine is found. So that's less than half the population are saying that they would return before a vaccine is found. 38% of those people who avidly follow the sports, arts, events and go to events said they were willing to wait for a vaccine even if it takes a year. So a year, they're willing to wait. So what we're starting to hear is the fear people have. So then it's our jobs as event managers to make sure that we're planning safe environments and we're marketing those, and that we're allaying people's fears if we can. That they can come to our events if we indeed deem our events safe to run. 59% of American sports fans agreed that until a vaccine was available, major sport leagues should hold games with no in-person fans. 55% of Americans said movies, theatres and concerts should not open before a vaccine is found. And what academics are saying is that until people feel fully safe, they won't go to large events. Because how enjoyable would it be to sit at the football if you're worried about what the person next to you, potentially if they have the virus. So in the UK, the BBC reported on a poll that found that 60% in the United Kingdom would be uncomfortable leaving home, even if restrictions were lifted. So this mentality that the restrictions will lift and out we go is actually in contrast to how people are feeling. 40% in the United Kingdom still reluctant to go shopping and send their children to school. 30% in the United Kingdom would be worried about going to work or meeting friends. 67% in the United Kingdom, so that's 67%, would feel uncomfortable going to large public gatherings such as sports or music events compared to how they felt before the pandemic. 61% in the United Kingdom said they felt uncomfortable at the prospect of using public transport. And this is interesting because if you're planning an event that the major way of getting there is through public transport, and we know that people are saying they feel uncomfortable catching public transport, what arrangements do we need to do in place if we suddenly think our guests will start driving and needing to park? So these are all the things we just need to start thinking about as we move into running our events. 26% in the United Kingdom of 18 to 34-year-olds were comfortable going to a sporting match or music festival, and that's in contrast to 9% of 55 to 75-year-olds. So certainly young people are more at ease at the moment. So if we think about that poll that we just ran of which areas and which activities we would feel comfortable in doing, it's pretty similar to research that's coming out of the UK. So people are feeling very comfortable with going to meet friends and family if the lockdown is lifted in the next month. Supermarkets, that was similar to us, shops, going to the workplace. But then we get down to bars, restaurants, public transport. And I think actually our data might have been almost identical in the trend there. So that gives us an idea of how people are feeling and how we're going to start to return to some normality. And I found it really interesting, the BBC in one of their articles talked about the vast majority in the UK who are obeying the rules are doing it not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Even though they didn't like being in lockdown, it's actually something they wanted to do. So if we think about that coming out of lockdown, how will people re-emerge? So the creature self, that which gives us emotion, is wary of changing the routine we've learned to like in the past month. And I find this quote really interesting, and it's in regard to COVID, because we've been in lockdown now since March, and we'll find out potentially today or Monday in Australia what that will mean, you know, the next 4, 8, 12 weeks. But we've changed our lives long enough to start changing habits. So what has happened in lockdown has actually become our new normal. So even though we might know we want to go out, our creature self is actually telling us something different. So once again, let's think back to our events. So if we know people want to come to a ladies' luncheon, but perhaps their creature self has become the new norm of being cocooned in a home that they feel is safe, what can we do, even though when we know our lunch is safe for people to come to, what sort of things do we need to communicate to them to allay their fears? So the factors, and actually I'll just, before we get on to this, go back, I also looked into some research that had come out of Antarctica, where they'd gone down and studied how people sort of re-entered the real world after being in isolation in Antarctica. I'm certainly not saying that we're in Antarctica, but people really did have a hesitancy to rush back into normal life, which I think, you know, is interesting when we start to think about our events. So we've looked at how behaviours can change during a health crisis. We've looked at how people are feeling, that they're frustrated, they're disconnected, but they're excited, that they feel a loss of connection, but they're hopeful. We've looked at even if they want to come out straight away, it's going to be a staggered re-emergence, and potentially large events will be the last thing they'll think about coming to. Let's have a look at some of the factors that will be impacting on us with events. So, you know, one of the things I think you understand is as president is you're held responsible for everything, but you don't always have control of everything, right? And while I'm certainly not saying an event manager is the same as a president, we are responsible for everything when it comes to our event, but there's so much that we don't have control of. So what are the factors that will be impacting our event? It's not just the enforced restrictions, and it's not just the economy. So certainly the forced restrictions will have an impact because we will have to implement social distancing and particular hygiene things that are determined by the government. There will be an economic impact because perhaps we won't have the money to spend the events like we did, or our clients won't have the money to spend, or our guests won't have the money to spend. But there's actually a lot more than that. One big factor is the vaccine, because the talk is until we have that vaccine, our life won't go back to the normal socialising that we had. So that, you know, until we have that vaccine, we will need to start thinking about how we move and plan our events around the amount of people we've got coming there and how they socialise. Phases of COVID, because this might not be the only phase we go through. You know, if we come out of this phase, we go into restrictions. Potentially we have another outbreak. Our phase changes again. So we just need to be mindful of that. Emergence out of isolation. So as we've talked about, people will have different behaviours and they will emerge differently as they come out of this. And then what we want, or what our clients want. So our clients, if you're working on behalf of a client, might want to run an event straight away, but in fact your audience won't be ready. Or we might want to, you know, we've had to postpone an event from last year and we need to make budget, or, you know, this event becomes one of our major events and we need to postpone it. Is that actually what our audience want? And think about in our audience, if we know they're missing connection and we know events create connection, how can we be doing that while we're in lockdown? And I'll talk a little bit about that at the moment. So with all those factors in mind, what does this mean for events? So courage is the power to let go of the familiar. And that's really what we're doing. And I'm actually really excited about what the future events is, because for the first time, we're really going to have to question how we run events and not just do what we did last year or not just do the same old, but see how we can really improve our connection and the purpose and the meaning of events, which will naturally engage with our audience more, which will naturally get a better result for what we were looking for. So right back to basics. We'll need to understand our role and responsibilities. And this comes down technically to things like what social distancing measures we have to put in place, which are imposed by the government. What hygiene things do we need to put in place? How many times do we need the venue to do a clean? What sort of, how many hand sanitizers, this is right back to basics, but all those kind of things that we'll need in our event. We need to understand our audience. And we've talked about that before, of polio, what that legacy was, that they always needed natural light. So what will our audience want from coming out of this? We need to get back to our purpose. What was our original purpose of doing this? And if we look at a conference, our purpose was to if it was a professional development conference, our purpose was to deliver information and to give information to our delegates. Our purpose wasn't to run a plenary session and work breakouts. That just happened to be the platform that we delivered those in. But what we were doing was providing information and learning. And we did that by plenaries and workshops. So if you're going to move your event online, you've got to move online the providing information and learning. It's not just straight moving online plenaries and workshops. And there's certainly some great online tools that are very functional, but it's actually getting right back to the purpose, not just the way we delivered it. So if we look at some, sporting events, what were the purpose of the sporting events? Now, we may have delivered them because that's how they were best received, but can we get right back to that first purpose and understand how we could deliver them potentially in a different way while we're forced to either not hold events because of restrictions or as we start to come out of restrictions? Read the play. Understand how our audience is feeling. Are we going out too early with our rescheduled event? Is it too much? And I always think back, for anyone who's a Big Brother fan, if you think of how contestants came out of that Big Brother house, and it was a real assault on their senses. And if you think we've been, or the majority of us have been in our homes, perhaps if you're homeschooling, it might be a chaotic home, but a fairly quiet home in some sense. We may have only been really listening to the same 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 voices in person. And then we go to the supermarket, then we come back into our cocoon, and then we might hop on a Zoom call, but that's just done via video. And then you go to your first event with loud noise and people near you. How are you actually going to feel? This is the sort of stuff we need to start thinking about. Adapt for the good of the audience. So really start to understand what will be best for the audience. And if we think of the marketing point of view of where we talk about fulfilling a customer's need rather than fulfilling your need, are we fulfilling our audience's need, or are we actually fulfilling our need? So, if we look at an awards night, it was held for this purpose. Can we do that some other way? And understanding the role of our event, because events are around connection. When it comes down to it, it's an experience and it's connecting. So how can we deliver this, and how can we really strengthen this in a time that we know people are craving connection more than ever? And we've just got a Q&A come in, so I might just have a look. Yes, that's a great question. There will be a copy of this recording that will come out after the webinar, so you will get emailed with a video recording. So as I said, understanding the role of our event, we talked a little bit earlier about if there's a fear for events, even if we know our event has everything in place and we've done our due diligence to run a safe event, but we know our audience still have a fear, how do we allay that fear and how do we communicate and sell our event to them? So now let's look to the future, and what does this mean for the future of our events? People will forget what you did, people will forget what you said, forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And for anyone who knows me, you know that's probably my all-time favorite quote, but it really is so important when it comes to engagement. And to run a successful event, we need to engage well. So it's no use that we run our rescheduled event, you know, from March to January next year, and everyone turned up and the speakers all, you know, ran on time, or the music acts all turned up, but our audience or our delegates went away feeling anxious and a bit nervous, and they didn't feel safe. That's not a successful event. But if they went away feeling connected, and it was just the antidote that they needed, and they felt safe, and they felt that everything had been done in a safe way, then that's a huge success, along with, of course, all those other nuts and bolts. So we've looked at how behaviour can change during a health crisis. We've looked at how people are feeling now and the trend of how they're going to re-emerge. We've looked at all the impact and the factors that are on us and what that means. So let's have a look at the top 10 trends and what we need to start thinking about. Now, as I said, I was actually talking about these top 10 trends last year in my masterclasses, and I don't actually think they've changed. I think the top 10 things we need to think about with events have stayed the same, but it's certainly some different things we need to do in them. So we've talked about engagement, really talking to our guests, talking to our audience. As I said, if they have fears, how will we allay them? How will we really engage and engage authentically? And we do that by getting right back to the purpose, understanding how people are feeling. Now, if you know that one of your events is around connection, is there a way that you can be running it online in the meantime? Or is there a way you can be engaging with your guests during this time to still keep them engaged for when the event runs next year? Because what we do know, and any of those who came to the communications one, is if we stop communicating to people and just expect that we start that back up when the world comes back to some new normal, it's too late. We will have lost those people. But if you've got, and sorry, Liza, I keep looking at your ladies' luncheon, but if we look at, say, the ladies' luncheon or an awards night, now perhaps you've had to postpone it. What you don't want to do is just say, we're running that next year and see you then. Keep them engaged during it, because if you've kept them engaged, you've been by their side that whole time, and they know that you don't just come to them when you need them to buy a ticket and spend some money at a fundraising event, or, you know, buy a ticket to a conference or buy a ticket to a theatre show, but you've stayed connected with them that whole time. When you come together for the in-person event, perhaps you've held one online in the meantime, but you come together for that in-person event, that connection will be so much stronger, that engagement will be so much stronger, and you'll have a hugely successful event. Health and wellbeing. We were starting to do this anyway, and if we think about conferences, we're starting to have chill out zones and maybe some, you know, yoga sessions and more fresh air based around what was wellbeing and healthy. Obviously, going forward, wellbeing and healthy will be around how we protect our events and how we safeguard our guests and our audience because of the restrictions we need to put in place, whether that's social distancing. I said earlier, the amount of times we need to clean the venue, what sort of things we're doing around hand sanitizer, around moving people through, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also talking to people's health and wellbeing. And if we know that during this time there's that loss of connection and that has an impact, how do we turn that in the reverse and really show how the connection can improve people's health and wellbeing? Purpose, I've touched on this before, because for me it's always got to go back to the purpose of why we were running this event. And if we think back to that early data around what people are looking to be as they come out of this, is more purpose driven. We know people are valuing actual contribution. So people, you know, I think to me this was starting to happen anyway, but I think this has just sped it up. So if we can really nail our purpose, people understand why they're an event, and that it's not just potentially a rah-rah sort of event with no, not that there's anything against rah-rah events, but it's got to have a purpose. And then when people feel connected to that purpose, they'll be more engaged. So how can we pull more of that into our events? Programs. Let's not overwhelm people. People's habits are changing. So they're not necessarily going to come out of working from home and sit in a conference venue for 8 hours that they might have done post-COVID. How can we change the programs around? How can we really mix it up and create more variety? And think about different habits that people have had forming in lockdown. Let's not just go back to the same old when we return. Food. This has always been a huge one for me because I think food is can be the make or break of events. Before COVID, there was a real move away from food wastage. And anyone who works in events and particularly things like conferences, that food wastage of at the end of morning tea, there seems to be all this food left over, or at the end of lunch, there's still platters of sandwiches. There was a real trend away from that, and people were becoming a lot more focused on healthy food, on food that matched the event. So I always tell an anecdote of a friend that went to a health information day, and they served party pies and sausage rolls. So, if your food doesn't match your event, you've killed your purpose right there and then. You've got a complete disconnect. So food's really got to connect in. Actually, all these elements have to connect in with your purpose. So if we know people are already moving away from food wastage, and now we think we've been in a time where we can't get flour or we can't get sugar off the shelves in supermarkets, and we've started to have restrictions on our food, or they're lifted now, are people going to go back and just have this complete array of food? How jarring will that be? And in fact, will we be moving away from shared platters? Because how hygienic are they? Think about how your food is served at an event. Think about a gala dinner, a breakfast, a conference. You've got a communal jug of water in the middle of the table, or you've got a communal bottle of wine that people pass around and pour, or you've got, a jug of orange juice. And you've now then got 10 sets of hands touching that one same surface. And what have we been taught to do for the last 10 weeks? And will we continue to be taught to do is not to touch shared surfaces. So what sort of elements around those kind of things will we need to change and adapt based on health and well-being and hygiene, but also based on behaviours? Technology. Now, a lot of us are moving on to technology, and I know there's some on the webinar here today that have been running some of their events online, which is fantastic. And I certainly think there's nothing wrong with online events. But what we can't do is just convert an in-person event and run it the same format online. Because research shows that people don't have the same attention span on screen as they do in person. So what might have been a 5-hour conference session made up of workshops and plenaries won't relate online. And if we also think of the distractions we've potentially got at home while we're tuning in, how can we keep people's engagement? Let's get back to our purpose. What was the purpose for running the event? And let's think about how we move that purpose online, not just convert the in-person format to an online format. We also know, and research is showing, that people are losing focus during the current crisis. So even though they may have had a certain attention span online pre-COVID, attention spans are waning during this time. So we need to think about that too with our events when we go online. The other thing is, if you're running events online, have a look after, and you should be able to get the data. How long did people stay online? If I run this 1-hour webinar and I get the results and find people dropped off at about the 15-minute mark, then I know I haven't hit my purpose. But if I can see that people have stayed right until the end, I know I've kept them engaged. So be sure to look at your own data around that. Remoteness. Now, this was already happening, whether it was dialing in speakers from overseas or interstate to save on costs and carbon footprint, or whether people actually just wanted an opportunity to dial in from home. Remote participation was already happening. But what's key is, in order for people to participate, you need to get them to play. So start thinking about how interactive you can make your sessions, because you don't want to just sit for an hour and listen to a webinar where you haven't been able to vote, you haven't been able to write your name, you haven't been able to see who else is on the call, you haven't been able to see the results from your voting. You're just watching a straight presentation for an hour. And then you have a 5-minute break, and then you've got your next session for an hour. Will that actually engage, because you're not giving people an opportunity to play. So have a think about your event, getting back to your purpose of how you can get them to play. When I mean play, not necessarily play a game, but how they can be interacting and participating. The next one is crowd science, and I had been really interested in crowd science from a much larger probably scale. And for those of you on the call who work at festivals, I'm sure you do a lot around this, of how people move at events and what people's behaviours and sort of pedestrian behaviours are once they get to an event. But this is something we're really going to need to think about, particularly around how people will socialise at an event, how we'll create social distancing. So the old days of, and I'm thinking particularly of a women in leadership dinner that I run that starts off with a cocktail party in the foyer of the venue, and it's packed and it's loud and it's, you know, the energy's buzzing. But at 500 people, if we can run it with 500 people, going to want to be packed into a small space with a lot of noise. Remember, they've come out of a cocooning time where we've had not a lot of noise. Is that something they're going to want to do? Even things like toilet breaks. So if we think we've got to wash our hands for 20 seconds, and potentially that's longer than people have been washing their hands in the past, people are going to take longer in the bathrooms. So are we going to need longer breaks for our dinners or for our conferences? Are we going to need more toilets if it's at a festival? How often are those toilets going to need to be cleaned? You know, if we think of a room refresh at a conference, is that going to take longer because they're going to do a more thorough clean, and then do we need to make our break longer? The end of the handshake. I run graduations and awards nights, and certainly that will be the first thing that will go. And we will actually need to rethink how we run those, because if we're handing someone a graduation tube or an award that's been held by someone else, and we know we've been told to clean our hands when we're touching shared surfaces, how comfortable are people going to feel? So we need to start taking that into consideration. How will people get there? How will they actually move to your event? And we've talked about this already, that if you've got an event that you know, is in the city and it's mainly public transport that people get to it, or you hold it in the city because that's where your audience are working. Now we know people are working from home and not everyone will rush back to work. So now you've potentially got people coming from outside the city that you didn't previously have. So you need to start thinking about car parking. Or if people have got a fear of going on public transport, does your venue actually accommodate an increase in cars and an increase in driving? So start to think about those kind of things with your crowd science. Venues, now this is another passion of mine for anyone who knows me, is natural light. Natural light, so much research shows the importance of natural light on learning. We know it with schools, on our moods, on our concentration. So I have a big passion for always holding events in rooms with natural light. So this, now we need to start thinking about, okay, people have been cocooned. So just think about yourself. You've been home for 10 weeks. Potentially 12, 14, who knows? You go to your first conference and you're in a room with no windows and you're now in there for 2 hours, and you go out quickly and you go to the bathroom and you get something to eat and you're back for another 2 hours and you barely see daylight. How are you going to feel when you've been, in essence, cooped up? And if we think back to my polio friends, the impact that epidemic still has on them. So start to think about your venue. Now, you might have a venue that doesn't have natural light, but it might in the actual room, but you might have other areas that have natural light. So how do you use those? How do you use fresh air? So we know being outside and fresh air is, you know, sort of creates a bit of a safer environment. So are there outdoor areas for your event, if it's an indoor event, that you can use? You also need to start thinking about, does the venue meet the requirements? And there's an event that I work on, which we thankfully held just before COVID hit. And we know the capacity in that room, and we expect every year that event will grow. But we now need to think that, okay, we're actually going to have to be a lot more spaced out in that room. Even if restrictions are lifted, people will naturally not want to be cooped up next to each other. So that changes the amount of numbers we can have in that venue. So do we actually start looking for another venue? And as I said earlier, starting to think about shared surfaces and how you eliminate those or how you manage those at your venue and at your event. So if you have an area, and like if we think about portable loos at a festival, now you're in the portable loo, you've washed your hands, you've done your, you know, however, your 20 seconds, but then you've got to open the door again, which has been touched by a whole lot of other people. And you perhaps close the door again, which has been touched by people before they went into the loo and touched their hands. So do you have stations of hand sanitizer nearby that people can use to then feel safe coming out of it? And we've probably experienced it at the moment going into a supermarket. If there's hand sanitizer at the start, and if we can wipe down our trolley, we feel safe. We do our shopping, we come out, we get some hand sanitizer again, and we feel good. But if we go into the supermarket and there's no wipes left for our trolley, the hand sanitizers run out at the entrance, how does that make us feel? So thinking about those things with our venues. And the final one is carbon footprint, which had more and more become a real trend that people were having had much more of a focus on the environment. So how do we carry that through after this? And if we've, you know, been looking at how the world has reacted in an environmental way, and we know how much the world perhaps has repaired, how is our audience or our delegates or our guests or our festival goers going to feel if they turn up and suddenly we've got excess packaging and we've got excess boxes and we don't have recycling? How is that going to jar against everything they felt during lockdown? And there are things we're going to need to rethink that will challenge us. And I sat on a recent international event, hackathon, around the sustainability of events. And we talked about things like shared, you know, water jugs, and you each have your glass. Now, we've been, you know, most of us have been enforcing with venues, we don't want bottled water, we want water jugs or water fountains with glasses that people can use. But now we're knowing that shared surfaces are unsafe. We don't want to go back to necessarily bottled water. What sort of things are we going to do? So it's just to keep in mind those elements. So they're the top trends that we can start to think about, of little things that we can do at our events that will tie back to our purpose, will create that safe environment and will really connect with people in a time where they're feeling disconnected. So we talked about engagement, we talked about wellbeing and health, we talked about purpose, programs, food, we talked about technology, remoteness, crowd science, venues, and carbon footprint. So the purpose of life is to live it, to taste experience to the utmost, to reach out eagerly and without fear for newer and richer experience. And I love this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, because I really do think that this is a time where we can really go forward and reach out to this new future that will create a newer and richer experience, because it will force us to go right back to our purpose of why we were running the event, rather than perhaps what we had already been doing. So we've looked at the impact that health crisis can have on people's behaviour, that can have on society. We've looked at how people are feeling now. We've looked at perhaps how people are going to emerge coming out of this. We've looked at all the impact that it might have on events, but an exciting future forward, because we really get to be the future and we get to design our events around our audience. And we've looked at those top 10 trends that we can start to think about with our events as we start planning for the future. So we've covered quite a bit in an hour, and I really thank you for your attention. And I'm popping back here now. So if you want to pop any questions in the chat box, please feel free to. Or if there's any experiences that you find that you're having at the moment with your events, would love you to share. As I said, this is part of our webinar series where we've looked at 3 different things. We've looked at volunteer management, we've looked at communications, and we've looked at events and how we adapt in 2020. Because it really is adapting now for the future. It's not about adapting now so we change our events for the next 3 months and then go back to the old normal. It's really about how we adapt our events now to really take us into the future. So a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and that's the spot that we're all standing at the moment. And as I said, I'm actually really excited for what the future holds. I think there's so much great stuff that will come out of this, which will, you know, we've all gone through a tough time as organisations and event managers that have had to really cut our events. But there is some real green shoots that will come out of this. So here are some of our social media channels. Fetching Events also has we used to run it monthly actually in EDM, but we've started to do it weekly because people are quite thirsty for information. And I've just popped a link in the chat box that you can just copy and paste that link into your web browser if you'd like to sign up for our weekly e-news, and we'll start to go back to fortnightly and then monthly. We're also keen to know, are there any particular areas you would like more information about and that we could run a webinar on? So this isn't just about us wanting to run webinars on what we think you're interested in, but it's really addressing challenges that you're going through. So if there's anything in particular that you're keen to know about or you'd like to explore more, please do let us know. Write it in the chat box or feel free to email us. And following this, you will receive an e-news, which will include a link to not only this webinar, so you can revisit it, because I do know that I talk fast and we've covered quite a bit of ground, but it will also include links to watch our 2 previous Adapting in 2020 webinars that you might be interested in as well. So we've probably got a couple more minutes for questions if anyone wants to pop them in the chat box. Otherwise, it's been fantastic to have you all on the line, and I know you've been dialing in from all sorts of places. So I really do thank you for your time, and please do feel free to, as I said, follow us on social media, connect with us, because this is a really a time that we want to help people and, as I said, really strengthen our events so they serve that pure purpose of connecting. Excellent. Well, thank you again. I wish everyone a safe and happy and healthy weekend, and hopefully we'll see you at one of our other webinars in the future. So bye, everyone.